All right, so now we switch a little. We add in AI and games and the lessons that we can learn from it, in particular with personalization. So Ray Soto from Loric Games.
It's pretty amazing to be invited back here. And as I started to think about what I wanted this presentation to be about, I'm starting to consider the evolution of technology, games, but more specifically, what audiences are expecting from the things they interact with, apps, websites, games, and what we can learn from one another. What I want to do is I want to start with a question, and this is inspired by a conversation I was having with Chris last night over dinner. Just by show of hands, be honest, how many of you play games? That's awesome. That's fantastic. For those of you who didn't raise your hands, I can almost guarantee you that you are interacting with apps right now that are inspired or leverage technologies that come from games. So there's quite a bit of commonalities between the two, and that's some of the topics I'll be covering within this presentation. So a little bit about me. I'm a game developer who went into the journalism industry, who then left the journalism industry to start a gaming studio. It's been an interesting journey over the course of about 20 years. And all of this really, the work that I'm doing now is very much inspired by the journalism industry. It's pretty wild when I think about, 8, 9 years ago, I received a phone call from Gannett, who truthfully I'd never even heard of, and I was mispronouncing their name, asked me if I knew anything about VR storytelling. Full transparency, I didn't really want the job. I had nothing to do. I was actively interviewing for my dream role. But I went in anyway, and as I started to walk in, I met Dan Pacheco, and I saw the USA Today logo, and I realized, wait a minute, this is factual storytelling. There's something interesting here. And through that kind of 3-month contract, I was really inspired about how we can merge games, technologies, VR, where that might be going with factual storytelling. And it's one of those things where the course of 8 years before I decided to leave the industry to start a gaming studio, I'm pulling so much from there, from what I had learned from audience expectations, from telling stories, how to research and kind of gather information that will help not just inform the factual reporting side of things and who you work with, but more along the lines, are you reaching the right audiences? Are you targeting the right stories, and on from there? And ultimately, it really does come down to is I've got this really, really deep passion for interactive storytelling and immersive experiences. So, interestingly enough, this final picture here, the largest one that you see, was my final day at Gannett. It was still in the pandemic. I walked in. I was the only one in the office. It was surreal. Packed all my things into one box, and I said, "Okay, I'm done for now." And by the way, the job that I ended up turning down to go in journalism was to art direct a Star Wars project. So what do we do at Loric Games? Loric Games, we started about 1.5 years ago. We are a VC-backed indie studio. Our goal is to self-publish our games. But ultimately, what we want to do is we want to really dive into shared story experiences. A lot of this stuff is going to be driven by AI, and we've done quite of our own internal work to start, cataloging event logs and generating narrative, and I'll dive deeper into a lot of that type of stuff. But I feel as if none of that would have been possible had it not been for the co-founders and the team that we currently have put together that is providing those diverse perspectives when we want to consider what type of stories do we want to tell, what technologies and tools do we want to employ, who do we want to target, and on from there. Folks that work for us have worked on major IPs like Fallout, Game of Thrones. You think about Warhammer, Star Wars, it's pretty broad. And I think when you look at kind of the resume that we all have, it's all about storytelling. And I think that is a pretty consistent theme. So it's really, really exciting for me to be able to kind of pull what I've learned in media into games and on from there. But still, it just comes down to the question, why games? To go back to the story of me going into the journalism industry, about 3 months after I had finished the contract with Gannett, they had hired me full time, and I was invited to ISOJ to speak about the work we were doing. And I met Robert Hernandez for the very first time, and he came up to me and he's like, "Are you crazy?" And he was asking me, why did I leave tech and games to work in media? And I was like, oh, it just makes sense. And for me, it's really interesting that the last two presentations have really dived into the technologies that they are using, and how they are starting to think about these digital dioramas and how do you interact with them, how do you deliver them to the audiences you're trying to reach. And there's a lot that we can learn from one another. So when I ask this question as far as why games, to me it makes perfect sense. But at the same time, the gaming industry should be also asking themselves, why media? Why should we consider media? Why should we consider journalism? There are a lot of parallels across those two and even beyond into other industries as well. So a lot of the work that I was leading over at Gannett, it was very much leveraging different technologies and ways that we can recreate these environments. And I find it really interesting that now we're talking about handheld LiDAR capture to capture a statue. 6 years ago, for us, we didn't have that. So what did we have to do? We had to hire a helicopter with a LiDAR sensor and this massive camera and fly over areas of the US-Mexico border to be able to render out a 3D environment onto Sketchfab. So it's insane how over the course of just a handful of years, that technology has started to get smaller, 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 and everyone can pretty much put it in their back pocket and start to create these types of stories. And interestingly, and I didn't know this until a couple years afterwards, but this right here is also leveraging AI. That through these photographs, the algorithm starts to make predictions as far as how these pixels come together to generate terrain deformation, where assign the textures to it, and that's all AI driven. So to be able to leverage that 6 years ago in this way has helped better inform us as far as considerations of how we might be able to leverage AI when it comes to developing these types of stories for different communities on from there. But some of the work that we were also doing at USA Today was augmented reality, and that was, I would say, probably a bulk of the work that I was leading while I was there. And this particular story for me is the one I'm most proud of. There was, small newsroom that had reached out to us and said, hey, we have an idea. We are looking to tell the story about the Freedom Riders and the attack on the bus in 1961. They had proposed a story, and for I think all of us, we start to talk about the ethics, the considerations, how we're going to tell the story. And they threw something that made me really excited. They said, we're actually interviewing Hank Thomas, who was on the bus as a teenager when it was attacked. And I was like, that changed everything. So to have factual accounting and to be able to work with them and historians to recreate a timeline of the events that he had experienced, with Hank Thomas himself through audio being able to narrate this, provided a unique opportunity to serve this story through AR through our app. And here's an example of it.
In 1961, an integrated group of civil rights activists known as the Freedom Riders boarded two buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans.
Anniston, everybody knew more than any other city, was absolutely very dangerous.
A flaming bundle of rags flew through a broken window, engulfing several upholstered seats. Dark smoke filled the bus.
And in that second, he pulled his gun and fired into the air, but during the time he pulled his gun and fired into the air, I thought he was going to shoot me.
So it was a really, really powerful story, and wanting to ensure that we were transparent in the sense of we wanted to make sure that we illustrated this essentially. We didn't want to trigger anyone. We didn't want to misrepresent anything with, let's say, almost true to life representations of the bus. But for me, this is one of those stories that towards the end of my time at Gannett that really stood out to me in the sense of, okay, we figured something out and I'm pretty proud of it. Even more interesting is the day that we had launched this particular story, the average time spent per user was about 350 seconds per, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about it. And my background in games, when I think about some of the mobile apps that we were creating, and this is about 10 years ago or so, if we had 344 seconds per user, that was a huge success. So to be able to get it for a story like this to reach our audiences was pretty spectacular. But one of the things that I want to start to kind of dive into now is this convergence. And it goes back to that question of why games, why media? And at Loric Games, as we started to evaluate where the opportunity might be, we started to notice this interesting convergence. And I talked about this last year, where you look at the tech industry, kind of, the Sony, EA, the game side of things, they've got premium content, games as a service, subscription models. On the other side, you've got more of kind of the traditional media streaming services, and those are starting to blend. You think about they're all trying to serve the same audiences. They are all trying to provide premium content. Everyone is fighting for the same eyeballs. But what's really interesting about this, after I started to review this particular slide from last year, it's how do they go about meeting those audience expectations. And what you see here is just an example from the USA Today app. But through that convergence and the lens that we approach interactive storytelling is, are we meeting audience expectations? And a year ago, I would say, okay, if it has these four, we're off to a good start. Strong visuals, interactivity, sound, and pacing. And pacing is really, really important when you think about how you want to tell a story through an interactive experience. But again, as you start to evaluate, there's something missing. The audience expectations are constantly changing. And I think that's one of the things that I find most relevant about conferences like this. When I think about the presentation I gave last year, I'm thinking about this particular presentation, you almost immediately notice that things have changed so much that we have to address it. And for us, it's augmented reality. It's artificial intelligence. But with that, I'm going to ask another question. When folks hear about AI, what do they think about? If anybody wants to throw something out. Robots? ChatGPT? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and yes. And interestingly... Oh my God! Oh my God! It's information overload. It's dizzying, exciting, it's somewhat scary, but honestly, it's mostly exciting. But it is a ton of information. When you think about you're already trying to reach an audience, you have to consider all these different things when it comes to some of those, the four that I mentioned, and now AI is being thrown on top of that. Through the lens of personalization, it's very, very difficult. My approach is evaluating everything through the bicycle wheel. Now, it might not make too much sense, but when you really take a look at the wheel, you've got your hub, which is essentially your home. That's the entry and exit point for your user. You've got all the spokes and you've got the rims. So think about there's an opportunity for any person who's engaging with your content, your app, it doesn't matter, can go anywhere they want, anytime. It's frictionless, and I heard that word in Dan's presentation. You want to make sure it's frictionless, and at the same time, it provides opportunities to extend value. Value. What is the value add that you're looking to provide to the audience through your app and on from there? So with a lot of the work that we do at Loric Games, and as we start to evaluate the opportunities for how we want to leverage AI, we evaluate through the bicycle wheel. Does it fit the bicycle wheel? If so, how? Does it not? Do we try to force it? If we have to force it, then we abandon it. Especially as a small studio, we have to ensure that we are rapidly moving ahead. But what I want to talk about now are some examples of AI, of what you're seeing. So in this example here, adaptive gameplay. Adaptive gameplay essentially is an experience that is changing on the fly. It starts to recognize behavior patterns. It starts to recognize, in this example, let's say in Mario Kart, if you're playing with friends and you are falling behind, AI will start to essentially give you extra pickups and start to ensure that things are a little bit closer together so it's fun. It creates a little bit more tension. It ensures that you're still somewhat competitive. So think about that dynamic difficulty adjustment. And all of that is part of that pacing, and I mentioned before, the tension. But interestingly, when you look at that lens of adaptive gameplay through Super Mario Kart, you also find that in things like Google Maps. Think about the behavioral analysis of when you're driving, it starts to recognize, okay, there's a traffic pattern, you're about to hit a major traffic jam, let me divert you. Or the recommendations that surface to you when you're looking for, let's say, a cup of coffee. All of that is driven through AI and that recommendation system. So, when I made the comment earlier in the sense of how many of you play games, and then, again, following that up with, you might not realize it, but you're also interacting with things that have been greatly impacted by some of the tools and technologies in games, such as Google Maps, as an example. I was talking to Subu this morning on the way here. We were talking about this particular topic, and he hadn't seen the slide, he hasn't seen my presentation, but he brought up Waze. And I didn't know this, but Waze has a gamification aspect. Did you pass an accident? Hit yes. You've got some sort of, I don't use Waze, but the way he described it to me, you start to gain points. Then his daughter likes to use Waze quite a bit, and she wanted to unlock a new skin. But to unlock the new skin, you have to drive 100 miles to unlock it. It's all gamification. It's all gamification. Procedural generation, generative AI. It's all about leveraging this algorithm to dynamically create environments, dynamically gather and deliver information. It's one of those things where this is one of those areas that is great to consider when you think about providing value, that extended value, the replayability to come back, that retention rate. So, the two examples here, Minecraft, I think, is pretty recognizable when you consider the unlimited replayability because of the generated terrains. But then on the flip side, you look at it, news aggregators, what they're surfacing to you. It's always new content, It's personalized. So while not necessarily generative, it is procedural. So there are a lot of themes of AI and personalization that you can pull and recognize from games into more traditional media and formats and vice versa. And lastly, the one that I find most exciting is dynamic narrative. Dynamic narrative essentially is being able to recognize the decisions that a player is making and adjusting the story on the fly to tailor towards maybe something that they're interacting with or the choices they are making. Branching narrative, think of it along that way. You're seeing a lot of that within virtual reality more recently. It's a super exciting space to be in. It's one of those areas that I had hoped to have attained when I was at Gannett, but it's very, very complex. You have to think about all of the different scenarios that might happen. The game that you see up here, the Mass Effect series, is a great example of branching narrative. You can select the type of player you want to be, the aliens and people you want to interact with, and the outcome at the very end of the game could be very, very different. Did you save all of your companions? There's quite a bit within there, but ultimately, it provides an opportunity for everyone to have a very different experience. And I've used this analogy in previous presentations, but I think about dynamic narrative happening right now. When you think about each one of us in this room, you're having a personalized experience. Everyone is going to walk away with something different, but we're all experiencing the same thing. So that's one of those areas that I'm most excited about, and I can't wait to see that expand even more. So the technologies that we're using right now at Loric, the first one to highlight is that procedural generation. What you see off to the left is a sketch. It is an idea, a concept piece of a series of floating islands. And using that, we decided, okay, can we recreate this using AI so it is a new gameplay experience every time you go into our game? And what we ended up doing is figuring out a voxel-based system in which we can start to deform, push and pull in different areas, and start to also define areas of nodes. And those nodes can be new characters. They can be, let's say, enemies. It expand on and on and on from there. But with what you see from the sketch and the idea, could we do something with AI, start to deform it, starting to create clusters of islands, and ultimately have a much, much bigger world that is completely generated by AI? And specifically, the environment here is just the trained information. So we knew right then and there that we had this opportunity to tap into this particular player base where they are expecting personalized experiences. They are expecting long replay value. And it's been one of those things where we are starting to define our own algorithm to get us what we hope to achieve based on that first concept art. But similarly, we're developing what we're calling a narrative sandbox. What we identified is, as part of a multiplayer experience, if we're all playing the same game, we lead busy lives. If I have to leave and then maybe I have to come back the next day, I'd go in and having no idea what everyone had done. So I essentially have to play catch up. So what we've done is we've developed this system in which we catalog, we tag things in our game, and if players interact with it, it creates a log. And through that log, we throw it into an algorithm, which then generates copy as a previously on narrative story, and then we generate audio against that. So here's a preview.
Ladies and gents, welcome back to Skies of Elysium. Last episode, a flurry of activity. Our dauntless heroes, Focus and Mighty Mouse, joined the game and set about changing Elysium's real estate. Focus channeled his inner...
So it's pretty crude, but essentially it was one of those things where it took the team about 2 weeks to develop that. It's like, there's something here that we can actually use for our game. So we're leveraging AI quite a bit in the sense of procedural generation to extend gameplays, personalized experiences through the narration, and for that, those are going to be real core features of our game. And the reason I feel it's really important to start talking about that stuff is how do we apply that to media? If you look at that narrative, the narrative side of things, perhaps there's an opportunity to essentially deliver personalized podcasts on a daily basis. Places you've been, perhaps maybe it's one of those things where events had happened, it's a town you had visited the day prior. There are a lot of opportunities I don't feel folks are starting to really tap into. I think there are a lot of great ideas. But what I find most interesting is how do we start to bring those together and start to think differently? I truly, truly feel there's a way for different industries to inspire each other, and through AI and this personalization side of things, something special could come from that. And it's one of those areas that I'm really, really excited about. So with that being said, I feel as if the future of content is immersive, interactive, and personalized. Last year, I said it was immersive, interactive, and 3D. But again, you have to always be reevaluating. Are you heading down the right direction? What might you be able to leverage in a new way? So for us, it's AI, and I would encourage everyone to think about AI just beyond generating more content, more articles, but more a personalized experience that is very much unique to someone. So I think that's all I've got. I don't know if there are any questions.
Is what you're doing, in essence, the same concept as what gamers would have been doing 20 years ago in terms of leading any industry that pays attention into personalization?
I find it interesting because 20 years ago, I don't feel as if the gaming industry was a club. Mm-hmm. I don't think they were really ready to kind of share. It's like, no, this is ours. We've got something here. I feel as if the industry is much more open now. And I see that at conferences like GDC, the Game Developers Conference, and I've been to for the past couple of years, where in the past it was always your EAs, Activisions, indie studios, but now you're starting to see other industries there, in which folks from, let's say, the medical community, how do we leverage these tools? Let me have these conversations with folks. How can we leverage AI in that sense? So 20 years ago, I feel like it was still fairly early on, but it's been really interesting to see that shift in culture. At the same time, just acceptance as well. I mean, I'll never forget when I first joined Gannett, it was one of those things where, what's this game developer doing here? Mm-hmm. No one had any idea. And fortunately, I had some great partners to be able to work with, but that started to change over the course of 2 or 3 years. And the same is true in the industry as well.
This was really awesome to see. Thank you, Ray. Do you feel like there's any opportunity for the dynamic narrative concept in nonfiction storytelling?
I do. I think about it in the way of, let's say, a museum experience. When you walk in, you can decide which direction you want to go in. And through that, to be able to surface content that is relevant to the journey that they're going through. At the same time, how you can recap that at the end of it as well. It's one of those areas in which some of the work that we were trying to accomplish at Gannett as it relates to branching narrative was very, very complex. We were such a small team. But with the tools that are available now, if I were still there, I'd be diving right into that to try to figure it out. But I do feel as if there's a really nice fit for it, especially when you start to consider even beyond the virtual reality and some of the Apple Vision, that side of things, the personalized audio podcast, as an example, newsletters on from there. I think it would really expand beyond just, okay, I'm going to surface the same content that I've surfaced to you, surfaced everyone else. So I do feel as if there's an opportunity. I don't know how to solve it, but it's one of those areas that as we start to dive into this dynamic narrative side of things, it's like, oh, there's something special here. So.
I'm going to take it. So that's really interesting because it reminded me of something more than 20 years ago. Before I worked at the Washington Post, I had an interview with a Reuters company, like a subsidiary, whose name escapes me, but they had news stories that would kind of change based on the age of the reader. So you'd be reading the news, and based on your age, like, and your comprehension ability, and they had all these educational experts. What are your thoughts on that? Like, is that still, like, nothing ever became of that? I don't think that they really continued that experiment. But the fact that we're not doing that in the news industry, like, do you think just with just age in particular, or like your level of understanding of something that is based on some other algorithm, like, should that be something we should be maybe personalizing based on, kind of like you are with the game?
I think there's an opportunity there, but I also worry about some of the ethical implications of that. Where what if through this algorithm you are surfacing content that someone might view as like, well, this has been dumbed down for me because of my age, or let's say the inverse of that, where that would be a concern of mine. But what I am interested in is through the sentiment analysis, what could be learned from that side to surface more personalized content through that way, as opposed to just tailoring it in the sense of, well, this particular audience, we know this is how they consume content. This has been written in a way that is more accessible to them. Like that side of things, I don't know right now, but when it comes to the personalization through that side of things, I do feel like there could be an opportunity to figure something out. All right, thank you.
Thank you.